Hello friends, welcome again to Learn with Lakshman Dharmaraj. We've been talking about the research process. In the last video, we have spoken about formulating the research problem, an extensive literature survey. In this video, we're going to talk about the rest of the steps in the process of research. Before I begin to talk about the rest of the steps in the process of research, I would request you to subscribe for the channel if you are new to it. The third step in the process of research is development of working hypothesis. What is working hypothesis? Working hypothesis is a tentative assumption made in order to draw out and test its logical or empirical consequences. See, research hypotheses are important because they provide the focal point for research. They does not let the researcher go away from the center point of the research. They are also important because they affect the manner in which tests must be conducted in the analysis of the data. Hypothesis should be very specific and limited to the piece of research in hand because it has to be tested. It is very important for the hypothesis to be specific and limited. Why it is important for the hypothesis to be specific and limited? Because hypothesis is a piece of research in hand that has to be tested later on after the analysis is done. Therefore, it has to be specifically designed and it has to be put in limited words. What is the role of hypothesis? The role of the hypothesis is to guide the researcher. And how does the hypothesis guides the researcher? The hypothesis guides the researcher by limiting the area of research. First of all, it limits the area of research and then it helps in keeping the researcher on the right track. There are two things it does. One, it limits the area of research, and second, it puts the researcher on the right track. It focuses attention on the more important facets of the problem of the research problem. Therefore, hypothesis is important. See, while preparing the working hypothesis or developing the working hypothesis, there are a few things that a researcher needs to keep in the mind. Development of working hypothesis is done by using certain approaches or by taking certain steps. Let's talk about these steps or approaches here. The first step in the development of working hypothesis is to have discussions with colleagues and experts about the problem. We can also have discussions with our friends from different universities and different colleges. We have to have discussions about the origin of the problem, the objectives of the problem, and possible solution of the problem. It helps a lot. The second approach or the second step in development of working hypothesis is examination of data and records. If there is some data or records are available, the researcher should examine the data and the records. If there are certain records or data available concerning the problem, for the possible trends, peculiarities and other clues, researcher can take help of that data and the records for the development of hypothesis. The third thing a researcher can do while developing a working hypothesis is to have review of similar kind of studies in the same area or of the studies on similar problems. The last thing the researcher can do in the development of working hypothesis is to have exploratory personal investigation that can involve original field interviews on a limited scale with interested parties and individuals with a view to secure greater insight into the practical aspects of the problem. Thus, it can be said that working hypotheses arise as a result of a priori thinking about the subject, examination of the available data and material, including related studies and the council of experts and interested parties. Thus, it can be said that working hypothesis arises as a result of a priori thinking about the subject, Examination of the available data and material, including related studies and the council of experts and interested parties. Working hypotheses are more useful when stated in precise and clearly defined terms. If working hypothesis is not stated in clearly defined and precise terms, then it may not be as useful as that one which is stated in precise and clearly defined terms. It should also be kept in the mind that occasionally a researcher may encounter a problem where the researcher does not need working hypothesis. This happens especially in case of the exploratory or formulative researchers, which generally do not aim at testing the hypothesis. Their aim is to explore the things. However, it must be also remembered that as a general rule, specification of working hypothesis is another basic step of research process in most of the research problems, though it is not there in some of them. Fourth step in the process of research is preparing research design. It is an important step because most of the research is carried out according to the research design. Therefore, a researcher must be very careful while preparing the research design. After formulating the research problem in clear-cut terms, the researcher should prepare a research design. The first thing researcher must keep in mind that the research problem needs to be formulated in clear-cut terms, and then research design should be prepared. Now, what is the research design? To be precise, research design is the conceptual structure within which a researcher would carry out his or her research. It is a conceptual structure within which a researcher is supposed to carry out the research. That is called research design, and therefore research design has great importance in the process of research. Preparation of research design facilitates research to be efficient. And what is the function of research design? The function of research design is to provide for the collection of relevant evidence with minimal effort, time, and money. If there is a well-prepared research design, it will save the time, it will save the money, and it will also save the efforts of the researcher. And see, preparation of research design actually depends mainly on the purpose of the research. If the purpose is exploration, if the purpose of research is exploration, a flexible research design which provides opportunity for considering many different aspects of a problem is appropriate. If the purpose is exploration, design should be flexible and it should provide opportunity for considering various aspects of a problem. Therefore, it is said that preparation of research design depends on the objective of the research. For instance, if the purpose of the research is description, the suitable design would be one that minimizes bias and maximizes the reliability of the data collected and analyzed. If the purpose is description, the design should minimize the bias and maximize the reliability of the data collected and the data analyzed as well. Things to be considered while preparing the research design are the means of obtaining the information. What is the means of obtaining the information? How the information can be obtained? The second thing that the researcher needs to consider while preparing the research design is that the availability of the skill of the researcher. How much skilled the researcher is. The researcher also must consider the explanation of the way in which selected means of obtaining information will be organized while preparing the research design. The researcher must also consider the reasoning that leads to the selection of a particular information or the material. Researcher should also consider the time available for the research and the availability of the finances. Thus, research design is a rough plan prepared by the researcher as to how research is to be carried out with the help of available information, time, money, and other resources. Next step in the process of research is determining the sample design. All the items under consideration in any field of inquiry constitute a universe or it is also called population. A complete enumeration of all the items in the population is known as a census inquiry. This type of inquiry requires a great deal of time, money and energy. If all the items are to be considered, if data has to be collected from every member of the population of the universe, it needs a lot of money, a lot of time and a lot of energy. Therefore, quite often, we tend to select only a few items from the universe for our study purposes. These selected items are called samples. What are samples? Samples are a few items from the universe selected for our study. That is called sample. The researcher must decide the way of selecting a sample, or what is popularly known as the sample design. That is popularly known as sample design. The researcher must decide the sample design. What is sample design? Sample design is the way of selecting a sample. As to how the samples are to be selected, or the sample must be selected in a particular kind of research. A sample design is a definite plan determined before any data are actually collected for obtaining a sample from a given population. What is sample design? Sample design is a definite plan determined before any data are actually collected from obtaining a sample from a given population. There is a population, there is a group. Now we have to obtain information from that group or data from that group. But we are not going to collect data from every member of that population. We are going to select a few members of them. Those members of that group are going to be our samples, and selecting those members is actually the sample design. The way in which we select the members is called sample design, and sample designing is extremely important in research. Now, there are several types of sampling. Probability samples, non-probability samples. These probability samples and non-probability samples can further be divided into several types of samples. Let us first of all try to understand what is the probability sample. Probability samples are the samples which are based on simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, cluster sampling, or area sampling. Probability samples are the samples in which each member has a chance of being selected. This is very important. What is probability sample? Probability is possibility. Probability sample is the sample in which every member of the population has a chance of being selected. And that means every member of the population can be selected in the probability samples. This does not happen in the non-probability samples. There is a possibility of every member to be selected as a sample. That is called probability sample. So, probability samples are based on simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, or cluster sampling, or that is also called area sampling, because cluster is equivalent to area. And as we have seen, probability samples are the samples in which each member has a chance of being selected. So, in technical terms, probability samples are also called non-zero possibility or probability. Non-zero possibility. I mean, there is no zero possibility of any of the member. Every member has a non-zero possibility of being selected as the sample. That is called probability sample. The members are selected on the random basis in the probability sampling. There are different methods of probability samplings, which are called random sampling, systematic sampling, and stratified sampling. We'll talk about random sampling, systematic sampling, and stratified sampling afterwards. There is another sample called non-probability sample. Non-probability samples are based on convenience sampling, judgment sampling, and quota sampling techniques. What are the techniques of non-probability samples? The techniques of non-probability samples are convenience sampling, judgment sampling, and quota sampling. We're also going to talk about judgment sampling, quota sampling, and convenience sampling later on. Let us try to understand what is non-probability sample. The samples in which each member of a group or a population in which each member of a universe or a population does not have the chance of being selected. That is called non-probability sample. Now, this kind of sample is called zero possibility or zero probability. The other one was called non-zero possibility or non-zero probability. This is called zero possibility or zero probability. Now, members of non-probability samples are selected in non-random manner. They are not randomly selected. If they are randomly selected, there is chance of being selected. Every member has a chance of being selected. But as they are selected in non-random member, there is no chance of every member of being selected. Now, the methods include in the non-probability samples are convenience sampling, judgment sampling, quota sampling, and snowball sampling. This was about probability samples and non-probability samples. Let's try to understand what is random sampling. It is said that the most commonly used form of sampling is the random sampling. That means random sampling is the most commonly used form of sampling. What is random sampling? Random sampling is the sampling done on a random basis. There is no systematicity in it. There is no stratification as such. You just pick out a sample randomly, and that is called random sampling. Now, though it is random, the results obtained are as authentic as obtained from the systematic sampling. Now, you have to understand as to how it happens. Though this is random sampling, though members are chosen randomly, the results obtained, it has been observed, found out that the results obtained are as authentic as obtained from the systematic sampling. There is no decided sequence for selecting the samples for the study. Samples are selected randomly. As samples are selected on the random basis, the chance element also comes into action in random sampling. That is there. Okay, because samples are selected randomly. As they are selected randomly, there is the chance element that comes into action. It's considered objective because the researcher does not use his logic or attitudes to select the samples. Random sampling is considered objective way of collecting information because researcher does not use his logic, he does not use his attitude, or he does not use any bias in order to select the samples. She just picks up the sample randomly. Therefore, it is also called the authentic method of sampling. After random sampling, we have systematic sampling because random sampling is seen in opposition to systematic sampling. What is systematic sampling? Systematic sampling is also known as nth name selection technique. Nth name selection technique. In this type of sampling, the required samples are collected first. Required samples are collected first, then the sample size is calculated and every nth entry is selected from a list. Nth entry. Okay. This sampling method is also good if there is no hidden order of the samples. Now, how are the entries selected? Entries can be selected in a specified and systematic manner. For example, we have 100 entries. Okay, from 100 entries, we'll select every fifth entry. For instance, fifth entry is selected, 10th entry is selected, 15th, 20th, 25th, 30th, 35th, 40th, 45th, 50th, 55th, 60th, 65th, 70th, 75th, 80th, 85th, 90th, 95th and 100. So thus you will select every fifth entry. In all, we'll be selecting 20 entries. 20 into 5 become 100. Instead of selecting all the 100 entries, we are selecting 5 entries and we are selecting every fifth entry. We can select every 10th entry also, or we can select every second entry also, depending on the number of samples required by the researcher. Okay, this is commonly used in analytical research. Systematic sampling is commonly used in analytical research. It tries to order the samples in a logical way. There is a logical way of ordering the samples. The ordering of samples depends on the researcher. I mean, researcher can think. You're free to choose every fifth, every sixth, every ninth or whatever. It can differ from researcher to researcher because the selection of the number of samples also depends on the researcher. After this, we have stratified sampling. What is stratified sampling? The word stratified is taken from the word strata or stratum. What is stratum? Stratum means a layer, group or the subset of a population. Okay. layer group or subset of a population. In other words, stratified sampling is a method of collecting samples by forming different groups of a population. Getting the point? Stratified sampling is a method of collecting samples by forming different groups of a population based on some common characteristic feature. What is stratified sampling then? Stratified sampling is the process of sampling in which members of a large group are divided into small but homogeneous subgroups. As they are divided into homogeneous subgroups or the strata, homogeneous subgroups are also called the strata. As they are divided into these strata, this type of sampling is known as stratified sampling. Stratified sampling is useful when members of a large group of a population come from heterogeneous groups. So you can make small groups, stratas, and find out the samples from them. Stratifying these heterogeneous groups into subsets of homogeneous groups and then selecting the samples helps in reducing the errors in research. Once we have the samples from heterogeneous group, what we do is we make the subsets into homogeneous groups and then we select the samples. If we do this, this helps in reducing the errors in research. After strata are defined, random sampling method can be used in order to select the samples from the defined strata. Once the strata are defined, once groups are made, then we can use the random sampling method in order to select the samples from the defined strata or the group. That is important. The stratified sampling method is preferred over the random sampling method. There are reasons for it. Why is stratified sampling preferred over the random sampling method? The first is stratification reduces the possibility of error in estimation if there is low standard deviation in a group of population. Grouping a population in smaller and heterogeneous groups or the strata makes many things easy to measure and less expensive comparatively. If there are fixed parameters as seen in case of stratified sampling, the results are more authentic. Stratified sampling helps in more clear understanding of the available data. The results obtained with the help of stratified sampling are generally found to be more accurate than the results obtained from the random sampling. Nonetheless, there are some limitations to the stratified sampling. Some of the limitations of stratified sampling are: number one, stratification cannot be done if there are no members belonging to the homogeneous group in a given population. Number two, the groups formed must be given proportionate weightage while selecting the samples. Number three, there is also a possibility that the members in two groups have some identical characteristics. Number four, stratification becomes difficult if the characteristics of the members of population are not clearly known. And number five, sometimes results obtained by stratified sampling can also be misleading if the stratification is not done properly. After stratified sampling, we'll see convenience sampling. What is convenience sampling? Convenience sampling is one of the non-probability sampling methods. In this method, data is collected from the conveniently available members of the population. Conveniently available members of the population. When it is impossible to test the entire target population in the research, the samples are collected as per the convenience of the researcher. Sometimes it happens. It becomes extremely impossible for the researcher to test the entire target population. Therefore, the researcher tries to collect the samples as per his or her convenience. All the members of the target population are eligible to be the samples in this type of sampling. For example, a NGO will select any 5 villages which are close to their head office. Convenience sampling is used by business brands and organizations to measure the effectiveness and disadvantages of their products in the market. They collect the data from randomly selected customers. After convenience sampling, there is something called judgment sampling. Judgment sampling is one of the non-probability sampling methods. In this method, researcher uses his or her judgment in selecting sample. As researcher uses his or her judgment in selecting samples, this method can also be called an extension of convenience sampling method because it is very much similar to the convenience sampling method. It is also called an authoritative sampling method because it gives authority to the researcher in selecting the samples. In this method, researcher can take judgment of sample selection in consultation with the research supervisor. The researcher can also consult any other expert in the field in order to take judgment about selecting the samples. Judgment sampling is less time consuming method of sampling and it is less expensive too. However, it is quite possible that it can be misleading as it is based on the subjective judgment of the researcher or of the expert in order to select the samples. Therefore, researchers should try to avoid the biases as much as possible. Next is quota sampling. Quota sampling is another non-probability sampling method. It is very much similar to stratified sampling method. Researcher takes a sample which represents a particular population in this method. The sample can be chosen according to the specific qualities required in research. While choosing the sample, the specific qualities required in the research are seen. The quota is decided by the researcher and samples are generalized to total population. Then there is controlled quota sampling and uncontrolled quota sampling. There are two types of quota sampling, that is controlled quota sampling method and uncontrolled quota sampling method. Researcher can choose any of these. In controlled quota sampling, there are some restrictions on the researcher. In uncontrolled quota sampling, there are no restrictions on the researcher. In this type of sampling method, researcher is free to choose sample according to his or her wish. And the last is snowball sampling. Snowball sampling is a special non-probability sampling method used when the required sample characteristic is rare and it is difficult to locate the respondents. It relies on referrals from initial subjects to generate additional subjects. For example, if a researcher undertakes the study of customer satisfaction among a group of rich club, the data cannot be collected unless someone from the club talks to the researcher and gives details of other members so that researcher can reach them. As this method is purely based on referrals, it is also known as chain referral sampling method. It is used when the members of a group are very less and it is difficult for the researcher to choose the subjects to assemble them as the samples for the research. There are certain ways of collecting data. These can be listed as postal surveys, telephone surveys, direct observations, internet surveys, face-to-face interview, checking historical records, checking government records, checking previous research and checking other records. These are some of the ways of collecting data one must keep in the mind. Next step in the process of research is execution of the research project. Execution of the research project is a very important step in the process of research. If the execution of the project proceeds on correct lines, the data to be collected would be adequate and dependable. You can depend on the data. It means that steps should be taken to ensure that the survey is under statistical control so that the collected information is in accordance with the predefined standard of accuracy. If some of the respondents do not cooperate, some suitable methods should be designed to tackle this problem. While carrying out the research, a researcher may face some problems. The researcher should have to use certain other methods to tackle these problems. One method of dealing with non-response problem is to make a list of non-respondents and take a small subsample of them, and then with the help of experts, vigorous efforts can be made for securing the responses. You can seek the responses by different methods or ways. The next step is analysis of the data. The analysis of data requires a number of closely related operations such as establishment of categories, the application of these categories to raw data through coding, tabulation, and then drawing statistical inferences. The mechanical devices can be used at this stage. For example, you can use computers for calculation. Calculators can be used, and several other things are there which can be used. A great deal of data, especially in large inquiries, is tabulated by computers. Computers not only save time but also make it possible to study large number of variables affecting a problem simultaneously. Analysis work after tabulation is generally based on the computation of various percentages, coefficients, etc. by applying various well-defined statistical formula. The next stage is hypothesis testing. After analyzing the data, the researcher is in a position to test the hypothesis. Now, hypothesis can be tested if there is a hypothesis. If there is no hypothesis, there is no need of hypothesis testing. So, this becomes an optional step. Do the facts support the hypothesis or they happen to be contrary? This is tested in the hypothesis testing. For initially, we have prepared a hypothesis, built a hypothesis. Now, we have got the facts, collected the data and understood everything. So, we see that if the facts we have collected support the hypothesis or are they contrary to the hypothesis. The hypothesis may be tested through the use of one or more such tests, depending on the nature and object of the research inquiry. Hypothesis testing will result in either accepting the hypothesis or rejecting it. We can either accept our hypothesis or reject the hypothesis, say that this is true or this is false. If the researcher had no hypothesis to start with, generalizations established on the basis of data may be tested by subsequent researchers in times to come. Hypothesis testing becomes an important step in this way. If there is no hypothesis, the generalizations of the research become hypothesis for other researchers in times to come. This has to be remembered. Now, generalizations and interpretation. If a hypothesis is tested and upheld several times, it may be possible for the researcher to arrive at generalization. That is, the researcher can build a theory. As a matter of fact, the real value of research lies in its ability to arrive at certain generalizations. If the researcher had no hypothesis to start with, he might seek to explain his findings on the basis of some theory. It is known as interpretation. The process of interpretation may quite often trigger off new questions which in turn may lead to further research. That is, researcher can state that there is scope for the further research. And last step is preparation of the report or of the thesis. The layout of the report should be as follows. It can be understood in three different stages. The first is the preliminary pages, the second is main text, and the last is the end matter. In the preliminary pages, the report should carry title and date followed by acknowledgements and foreword. There should be a table of contents followed by the list of tables and list of graphs and charts if any. The main text has introduction. Introduction should contain a clear statement of the objective of the research and an explanation of the methodology adopted in accomplishing the research. The scope of the study along with various limitations should as well be stated in this part. In part B, summaries and findings should be given. After introduction, there would appear a statement of findings and recommendations in non-technical language. If the findings are extensive, they should be summarized. Then comes the main report. The main body of the report should be presented in logical sequence and broken down into readily identifiable sections. Then comes the conclusion. Towards the end of the main text, researcher should again put down the results of his research clearly and precisely. At the end of the report, appendices should be enlisted. Bibliography should be given in the end. Report should be written in a concise and objective style in simple language, avoiding vague expressions such as it seems, there may be, and like. These expressions should not be used in the report of the research. That's all about the research process. I hope you have liked the video. If you have liked it, hit the like button and share this video with your friends. Thank you very much for watching.